7 surprising facts about early Christian iconography. These are 7 things that I think most people will find interesting, maybe new information about early Christian iconography. The first one is that early Christians might have inherited iconography from Hellenistic Jews. Now, some scholars explore the idea that the early church's iconographic tradition started with inheriting a Hellenistic Jewish art tradition, either through a synagogue art tradition or an illuminated Septuagint. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not saying that early Christian iconography comes from the temple art, the cherubim or something like that, or the Ark of the Covenant, but literally icons of biblical scenes and portraits of saints were in Jewish circles around the empire. And this could have served as the beginning of early Christian iconography. So early Christians or Jews during this time, during the first century, they had Jewish art, scenes from the Bible, things like that. They converted to Christianity and they brought with them art from their Hellenistic Jewish heritage. Jeffrey Spear writes, Christian artists were able to create an entirely new Christian tradition, drawing on Jewish artistic precedent and reinterpreting the vast repertoire of familiar pagan images seen all around them. He also writes extensively illustrated Bibles such as the Cotton Genesis, perhaps derived from Jewish examples, may well have existed and served as a source for Christian artists. Now, this might have been crazy to say 100 years ago. The scholarship would have laughed at you if you said, yeah, early Christians got iconography from the Jews. Because for many centuries, people, including the top scholars on early Jewish art, on Jewish art and Christian art, would have said that Jews were aniconic, they were iconoclasts, they forbade making images. But archaeology has revealed so many Jewish sites between the 3rd and 6th century, which include images. And this has led certain scholars to speculate, okay, well, maybe the Jews were not as aniconic as previously thought. Robin M. Jensen writes, prominent scholars have proposed the existence of a lost illustrated Septuagint, possibly emanating from Hellenistic Jewish circles as a source of scenes from the Hebrew scriptures in early Christian art. Okay, so scholars are trying to explain how early Christians and Jews, the relationship between their art, and they're saying, well, if there's synagogue art and there's continuity in some of the early Christian art, maybe they're drawing from the same source, an ancient Hellenistic Jewish heritage of iconography. And there's evidence for this in the archaeology. Jewish art from the 1st through 5th centuries has been discovered, ruling out the old theory that all Jews were aniconic. Some motifs used by Jews correspond to those used by Christians. So this is also very interesting that not only are Jews and Christians both using images between the 3rd and 6th centuries, but they're using, in some cases, the same images portrayed in the exact same way, which is, again, further evidence for a shared heritage, a shared tradition. So this sounded crazy until some of these synagogues were discovered, like Dura Oropos, Hamath Tiberias Synagogue, Hukok Synagogue, Sepphoris Synagogue, Beth Alpha Synagogue. But it's not crazy anymore. Right? This is a very real possibility. We have ancient Jewish synagogues like this one in Beth Alpha, where the floor is covered in beautiful art, including scenes and portraits with people. And in this case, we have a scene of the sacrifice of Isaac, and you can see Abraham there. And this actually corresponds to the exact same motif used by early Christians. And then we have the beautiful Dura Oropos synagogue with so many beautiful biblical scenes from the ceiling to the floor. And it shows all kinds of scenes from the Old Testament. And again, a number of these correspond to those used by Christians, which hints at a shared tradition, or at least maybe, like the scholars are saying, a shared Bible with these scenes in them. The second surprising fact is that scholars changed their minds about Aniconism in the early church. So you might be aware that extant early Christian writings are overall relatively quiet about images. Okay, so there's just not a whole lot of discussion in the earliest Christian writings on images. And when they do talk about images, okay, think of people like Clement of Alexandria or Tertullian, the impression they give seems to be negative. So this has left scholars for centuries claiming that the earliest Christians were opposed to images, or aniconic or iconoclastic. Yet archaeology, and specifically recent archaeology within the past 100 years or so, paints a completely different picture of the early church, producing many images from early Christian sites around the world, some dating back as early as the 2nd and 3rd centuries. So now we have 2nd, 3rd century early Christian writers who are maybe giving a negative impression of images, but then we have archaeology from the same time of early Christian art. So scholars are looking at these two sets of data, the writings and the archaeology, and they're making sense of it, saying, well, maybe that some Christians were against art and some weren't, right? So recent archaeological discoveries have caused scholars to reconsider the data and the place of imagery in the early church. Some of the best early Christian art scholars, like Robin Jensen and Mary Charles Murray, have concluded that not all Christians in the early church were aniconic, and the lack of images from the first 2 centuries can be explained by other things like destruction over time due to renovation or wars or fires, things like that, or economic and sociological reasons. Maybe the Christians from the 1st and 2nd centuries just didn't have a whole lot of money or property where they could produce the kind of images that we see in the 3rd and 4th centuries. But these are other ways to explain it other than Aniconism. Mary Charles Murray writes, it was until fairly recently that a universally held theory that the absence of art was due to the hostility of the early church towards religious imagery. A comprehensive theory was constructed, making of Christianity a normatively iconophobic religion because of its roots in Judaism. The introduction of art was seen as a part of a progressive paganization of the church. This account remained the framework of all thinking until the 1970s, when it was subjected to revision. So 1970s, like I said, this is very recent. You're not going to find 1800s and early 1900s scholars who are saying these things. It's taken time for scholars to process this new archaeological evidence, and some of the top recent scholars like Mary Charles Murray and Robin Jensen, Jeffrey Spear, are connecting the dots and saying, wow, not everyone in the early Christian church was aniconic, because we have images from them. The third surprising fact is that early Christian iconography has been found all around the Roman Empire. So you may be familiar with early Christian art from places like the catacombs in Rome or Dura Oropos, but those are not the only places where early Christian iconography has been found. It's actually been found all over the empire. So it's been found in places like France and England and Spain and North Africa. It's been found all over the Middle East and Turkey and Greece. Okay, so early Christian iconography dating from the 3rd to 6th centuries has been discovered across the empire. And this map is showing places where early Christian iconography has been discovered dating from the 3rd century or earlier. So this just doesn't apply to those 4th, 5th, 6th century examples, but this widespread dispersion of archaeological evidence for early Christian iconography extends all around the empire as early as the 3rd century or earlier. So this just gives you an idea that, okay, maybe there wasn't a sort of local development of iconography that spread around. Maybe Christians all around from the beginning were not aniconic. The fourth surprising fact about early Christian iconography is that the early church was richly decorated with art. So I found this very surprising when I started studying early Christian iconography. I sort of thought and assumed that the earliest churches would have been relatively plain and simple. But it seems like as soon as Christians were able, they were putting iconography everywhere, in their homes, on their jewelry, in their churches, in their public places. Jeffrey Spear writes, once Christians did attain wealth and property in the 3rd century, they were able to ornament their churches, tombs, and household objects as their pagan neighbors did. So the Roman culture at that time was very colorful, full of images and art and statues and paintings and wall paintings all over the place. And Christians were no exception to this. As soon as they had the means to do it, they started putting icons all over the place around places where they were living their lives and practicing their faith. And this is not surprising. These are Christians who wanted to live out their faith, and these icons drew their attention to principles of their faith and stories of the gospel. So archaeology has shown Christian iconography on cups, bowls, plates, jewelry, lamps, tables. These are household items. They've been found at burial sites and tombs, things like that. Churches, baptistries, villas, okay? So it doesn't seem to be limited to any particular place. The early Christians loved images and richly decorated the objects and places in their life with iconography. So here's some example. We have rings, table. This is a table support with a carving of the Good Shepherd on it. Cups have been discovered like this example from Germany, dating to the 4th century with scenes of the life of Christ. This is a terracotta bowl from North Africa, Tennessee, that dates to the 3rd century, and it shows Christ raising Lazarus. A number of flasks have been discovered with art on them. Um, this is a beautiful curtain that dates to the 4th century with biblical scenes on it. Pendants have been discovered with icons on them. This one has Daniel and the lions. This is a lamp that dates to the late 2nd, early 3rd century with biblical scenes on the top. And we know it dates to this time because it has a maker's stamp, a workshop stamp on it that tells us who made it. And we know that that workshop operated in this 2nd and early 3rd century. Iconography was on religious items like gospel book covers, thuribles. This is an incense burner that dates between the 4th and 6th century. Um, Illuminated Bibles came out of the early church, and unfortunately, these don't last very long. They're very susceptible to fires, they're very susceptible to destruction. But a few have survived, a few fragments, but we know that these would have been around in the 4th century, 3rd century as well. This example is from the Cotton Genesis, which dates to the 5th century. There's reliquaries that have been discovered. This one's from the 4th century from Greece. Panel icons would have been used as well. Again, these don't survive well over time. They're very delicate and can easily be destroyed by smoke from lamps or from fires, things like that. But this one survived in a collection from St. Catherine Monastery due to the climate there. So we do know through those icon panels, which have survived, that early Christians did have these things. And there was a tradition of having panel icons in the early church. And of course, sarcophagi. We have a ton of sarcophagi from the early church because it's made of stone. It's buried. Nobody bothers it. Lasts a long time. And it's just another witness to how colorful and richly decorated the early church was. This is a room in the catacombs of Priscilla, which dates to the 3rd century. And you can see how colorful and richly ornate this is in the biblical scenes in there. You have the 3 youths in the furnace. You have birds, Christian symbols. You have a painting of the woman who's buried here in praying position, scenes from her life. And then the famous baptistry from Dura Europos that from the ceiling to the floor is covered in beautiful paintings from scenes from the Bible. This is a cupola or a dome in a villa from Spain. And this dates to the 4th century. This is a residential building and was covered in beautiful art. This would have been owned and produced by a Christian because there are biblical scenes among these images. Again, they love to ornate or to decorate their places with this beautiful art. And a beautiful mosaic floor complete that was built in the 4th century, discovered in Aquileia, Italy. And this has biblical scenes of Jonah. This has a Good Shepherd, and it has portraits of probably donors who built it, and it actually mentions the name of the bishop under which this was built. And he lived right around that time of the Constantinian shift, but would have been ordained before the Constantinian shift, again indicating that this was an early tradition of being very decorative with beautiful iconography. So everywhere we look in early Christian places or objects, we see a lot of art. And I was very surprised by this. Like I said, I thought it was, relatively plain, and over time icons came into the church and became more popular after the iconoclastic period, things like that. But no, it seems like as soon as they could, they were richly decorating their sites and their objects with iconography. The 5th surprising fact is that early Christians shared an icon tradition. So I hear a lot of people talking about images in the early church, but they talk about it as if it was, yeah, the early Christians had an image one time or some image or some, art. But I don't hear a lot of people talking about the fact that it wasn't just some image, it was an image that was a part of a tradition, a part of a repertoire of traditional motifs. So archaeological evidence shows that early Christians were not original, making up scenes from their imagination, how they think things looked from the Bible, but they actually painted from a repertoire of traditional motifs. So some of the ways that these scenes from the Bible were being depicted is the same depending or all around the empire, different places. So Jeffrey Spear acknowledges this. He says the limited repertoire of images employed by the Christians in the 3rd and early 4th centuries was drawn largely from the Old Testament, although some scenes from the New Testament, including the Good Shepherd, the baptism of Christ, the healing of the paralytic, the raising of Lazarus, and some other miracles of Christ were also favored. Okay, so he's calling it this limited repertoire of images, meaning that the early Christians were not going through each page of the Bible and making up what they think they were seeing, but they had a limited repertoire. So even the selection of images that they're using was according to a kind of tradition. These are the traditional images that we use in our churches, in our homes, whatever. They weren't just making it all up. Michael Yanovich Rostovzev, he writes, "It is true that the painters of Dur were not creative artists. They certainly repeated to the best of their ability traditional motifs." Valeria Kuvatova writes, "The iconography of the most popular early Christian compositions had already attained a canonic form by the mid-3rd century. The iconography of most depictions of biblical episodes in Thessalonian tombs corresponds to the mainstream early Christian artistic tradition." So listen to the words the scholars are using, right? Repertoire of traditional motifs, an early Christian artistic tradition. These are strong words, but it shows you that it wasn't just some image that Christians had one time, but it was an actual tradition that was present and alive in the early churches that they were all participating in to some extent. Now, of course, there's local variations and there's differences in style, and some images are more popular here than here. But the fact that there is a consistency around the different archaeological sites indicates that there was, to some extent, a traditional repertoire of motifs that Christians were drawing from. And here's a list of some of those most common ones. You've heard a few of these already. Adam and Eve, Noah in the ark, Noah releases the dove, hospitality of Abraham, sacrifice of Isaac, and so on. And so early Christians, whenever they were applying art or they were building something or painting something, they would draw from this set of images and they would paint them or depict them exactly in the way, to the best of their ability, that they saw in other depictions of that scene, continuing in this participation of a tradition. The sixth surprising fact is that Orthodox iconography is a continuation of early Christian iconography. Okay, so iconography from the Orthodox Church and other Eastern churches like the Coptics, Ethiopians, Eastern Catholics, okay, all these Eastern churches have an iconographic tradition, which is a continuation of early Christian iconographic tradition. Okay, so what happened to that early Christian art, that early Christian tradition? Did it just die off over time? Well, no, it actually continues and has an unbroken succession in Eastern churches. So icons in an Orthodox church today, if you go to your local Orthodox church, you look at icons on the wall, you see pictures of scenes from the life of Christ. Well, those were painted from earlier icons of the same scene, which were painted from earlier icons, from earlier icons, from earlier icons, and so on, all the way back to this ancient early Christian iconographic tradition. Okay, so there's a succession there and a connection to that original deposit of iconography in the church. Leonid Uspensky writes, "We find the same consistency in the iconography of the festivals," talking about icons of scenes from the life of Christ on feast days in the church. And for the same reason, the very great majority of these images dates from the first centuries of Christianity and originated in the actual localities where the events took place. Almost all these images, like the festivals themselves, originated in Syria and Palestine. They were accepted by the church as historically the most exact and are still carefully preserved by the Orthodox Church. Here, too, striving above all to avoid any kind of invention, the icon adheres strictly to the Holy Scriptures and Holy Tradition. Okay, so there's this preservation of the original motifs of the early church continuing through Orthodox iconography. And you can see this with your own eyes. Here's an example of Daniel in the lions, and I have a 3rd century example, early Christian example of Daniel in the lions, a 4th century example from Hungary, and a contemporary icon of Daniel in the lions from the Orthodox Church today. And these are very obviously depicting the same story. And it's very obvious the similarities between these images, the way that Daniel is standing, the way his arms are positioned in Oran's position, his hairstyle, the number of lions, the positions of the lions. You could drop somebody from the early church in a modern Orthodox church, and they would immediately be able to recognize scenes from their icon repertoire because of the consistency in it. Now, of course, there are variations, right? His clothing is changing, colors are changing, right? Maybe the lion's looking here instead of there. There are local variations, personal variations, depending on the artist. But that core motif is still alive and well in the Eastern iconographic tradition. Another example is the healing of the paralytic, the way that Christ is standing, his position, his arm is extended. The paralytic, how he's positioned, how he's holding his bed, the way the bed looks, right? It's very recognizable. It doesn't matter which one of these centuries you're from or which one of these churches you're looking at, you would immediately recognize this scene if you were to visit one of these churches throughout space and throughout time. So there's this continuity in the iconography of the Eastern churches that you can see with your own eyes when you compare it to the early Christian art. And finally, the 7th surprising fact, the original Christian iconography consisted of biblical narrative scenes, okay? So when you think of icons today, you usually think of a portrait. Maybe it's a portrait of Mary holding Jesus, or maybe it's a portrait of Jesus or John the Baptist or some other saint. But archaeology shows a steady shift in popularity from narrative scenes to portraits in the 4th century forward, okay? So there was this shift over time of popularity between using scenes from the Bible to portraits of the people from those scenes in the Bible, right? So the original repertoire of Christian icon motifs seem to have consisted primarily of biblical scenes. Now, this probably had something to do with the needs of the people. So initially in the church, there was a huge need to evangelize, and images of the gospel helped to preach the gospel and to evangelize in the church. But as more and more people converted and people were born into the Christian faith, they didn't have as much need to evangelize as much as offer pastoral care and development of piety, and showing portraits of pious people drew the people to imitate those saints and to live pious lives. And according to Robin Jensen, there's also the change in the threat of paganism. As paganism died out, there was less and less fear of portrait type art being used in the church. Robin Jensen writes, by the beginning of the 5th century, portraiture was becoming a dominant type of iconography. And while narrative art continued to be produced for illuminated books or for decorative programs on church walls, saints' likenesses were everywhere, often as relatively inexpensive items that might be mass produced. So was portraiture a part of the church? Yes, of course. It was a huge part of the church, especially from that 4th century forward, and was probably there from the very beginning to some extent. But it seems like that initial iconography, that initial tradition of the church, was focused primarily on biblical saints. And you can see this shift with your own eyes when you look at the iconography. I have an example here from the catacombs of Priscilla. This is the Adoration of the Magi, very common icon motif that you find all around in early Christian art. And it's focused on the story. It's telling the story of the Magi visiting Mary. She's sitting in the chair, she's holding Jesus, and the 3 Magi are offering their gifts to Jesus. Well, fast forward a few centuries, and you see the same scene, but there are a few changes. Mary's chair has been rotated. Now she's facing the viewer, not facing the Magi. Angels have been added. Okay, so there seem and the Magi have been pushed to the side, right? They've been getting sort of pushed away from the focus of the image, which seems to be shifting towards Mary. Other 6th century art shows the same trend. We have a 2 panels here. One is an ivory panel from Greece dating to the 6th century. Now Mary's in the center and she's facing the viewer, and the Magi are still there, but they're sort of to the side, to the background. And you can see this slow development from a narrative scene to a portrait. And this is sort of that that transitional image that you can see, this in-between image going from narrative to what you would see today as a typical icon of Mary holding Jesus. Another panel from the late 6th century shows Mary in the same chair, in the same position, but now the Magi are gone. So eventually they just get dropped off. And now it's completely focused on the person of Mary, the person of Jesus Christ, and the saints who are flanking her. So this, and then we have a 6th, 7th century example, a century later, and now you have Mary holding Jesus by themselves. You don't have the Magi there anymore at all. Now the focus is exclusively on the people. And it doesn't mean that it's bad, or heretical or something to make Mary alone without the Magi. No, the narratives scenes has a purpose, and portraiture also has its purpose in the church. And there's just this interesting shift in the church of having exclusively biblical scenes or primarily biblical scenes to now having a sort of mix of biblical scenes and portraits of saints. So that's what I have for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, please leave a comment below. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, and I'll see you next time.